All right. Hi, everybody. This is Allie Day speaking. And I just threw we have a couple of slides just to orient you so that if you space out for a minute and you're like, wait, what virtual meeting am I in? You can look at the slide and remember where you are at any given time. So Holly and I have been working on this project, but before I sort of jump into that, I want to thank Dwight for organizing what has been so far a really fantastic series, Brown Bag series virtually. In addition to thanking the College of Arts and Letters for investing in all of our research and scholarship, Holly and I want to particularly thank the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs for awarding us the Interdisciplinary Research Initiation Award this past summer. So what we want to do this afternoon is show you all a bit of a film that Holly and myself have been working on in collaboration with Sue Carter and Richard Meeker at UTMC's Ryan White Clinic, Sarah Mouch in the University Archives, and Lee Fernside, who's an independent artist and grant writer. We also have had a few amazing camera operators and assistant directors, Gabe, Ali, and Marcus, students and graduates from the film program here. And what we're going to do, I'm going to begin with giving a broad overview of the film and how the project came into being, as well as some of the things I've been thinking about as a disability studies scholar and co-producer of the film. Following that, Holly's going to give you some guiding questions to consider as you watch a 24-minute clip. Then we would like to come back together for a bit of feedback from you all. The film, which we are calling HIV in the Rust Belt, comes out of a larger initiative that I began 5 years ago in the aftermath of some field research that was contributing to my book project. As part of that project, I had the privilege of meeting and working with several folks at the Ryan White Clinic here in town, and I realized that many of my collaborators were longtime activists and community care workers in the HIV field. And the stories they told were strikingly different from what I had learned about HIV history, a history that, when told nationally, largely focuses on activism on either coast. So I began a digital oral history project with Sue Carter giving me names and contact info of nearly everyone she could think of that was still around. And I did it in starts and stops, working with the Kennedy Center to upload it online. And then last summer, 2019, Sue Carter approached Holly Hay and I about doing a film project to interview long-term survivors. Film is clearly out of my purview, but I was eager for a meeting because I recognize the importance of documenting survivor stories. So we got together and brainstormed. Holly and I had never met before this, and it became clear that we could not produce a feature-length project in the 3 months that Sue originally proposed. She wanted us to have something to premiere on the December 1st World AIDS Day event. But we could begin interviewing survivors. So on a hot day in late August 2019, we interviewed 5 long-term survivors, 2 women, 3 men, 1 Latinx, 1 African American, 3 white, 2 ex-felons, 3 parents, some queer identified, some straight. The stories were diverse. In December of last year, we were able to screen some rough cuts of these interviews, and some of you may have been there, and get an overwhelmingly positive community response. And that is where the work we did this summer sort of picks up. So one of the threads through all 5 of the narratives of survivors was this appreciation and love for this place called David's House Compassion. I had heard of David's House years ago in my early days of collecting oral histories and was struck by what seemed like the uniqueness of the grassroots organizing and the longevity and reputation of what became a kind of Toledo establishment. I was thrilled when Holly turned to me following our long day of interviews in 2019 and said, "What is David's House? That seems important." And I said, "That's our angle." So we set out this summer to try to tackle a telling of the story of David's House Compassion through the eyes of survivors who lived in or utilized its services, as well as employees and volunteers. I spent hours in the Kennedy Center archive, once lockdown permitted me to, reading David's House papers, all of which were donated years ago. Through 13 years of board meeting minutes, handwritten thank you notes, and fundraising flyers, I pieced together a timeline that begins in 1988 and ends in the early 2000s. What I'm going to do now is just read a few excerpts from an essay that I've been working on for a special issue of Culture, Health, and Sexuality. The issue is asking contributors to connect HIV with COVID-19, so I thought this might be a good way to frame some of our conversation today. The essay begins with an epigraph, and let me just pull that slide up for you so you can read along. So the essay begins with an epigraph. Quote, in the United States and elsewhere in the world, in both secular and religious societies, perhaps no single view of the epidemic has done more important cultural work. The call for compassion and caring has served important social ends, asking citizens to rise above prejudice, discrimination, and fear and help the suffering. At the same time, no other single view is overarchingly irrefutable, so unreflectingly embraceable, or so glibly deployable in short-circuiting discussions of structural inequalities, politics, and economic needs. Thus, this meaning, too, AIDS activists came to believe they must challenge. And they did so by mapping onto this human tragedy the repeated failure of social, biomedical, and political institutions to carry out their traditional responsibilities in times of epidemics and comparable disasters. Sounds familiar. So this is how I begin the essay. I have driven by this building so many times, picking up a young woman in foster care whom I mentored for 5 years. The convenience store across the street has been a pit stop for us to buy candy and coffee before going to the movies or for a walk in the city's Metro Park. This house, the only single family in sight, was invisible to me, its paint colors muted, its narrow yard flanked by larger multifamily homes. I notice as I approach the porch, adjusting my cotton face mask and mopping my brow that is dripping with the mid-July humidity, that Rusty and Elaine have put up a Black Lives Matter sign. Just a few evenings earlier, I was in a crowd of more than 100 laying in another busy intersection, protesting police brutality and the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. The movement of Black Lives Matter has been in the forefront of my mind as I've spent the last few months combing DHC's papers, held by the University Library Archive. In board meeting minutes from 1989, there is discussion, hours and hours of discussion, of the need for housing for people with HIV and the search for appropriate buildings, size, layout, bedroom, and zoning regulations. Is this a group residence? How many people? As well as ADA compliance, which is a newly passed legislation. Sister Elaine, a towering figure in the archives, emerges again as I leaf through the meeting minutes and newspaper articles. From what I can put together, Sister Elaine contacts the Catholic diocese. The diocese agrees to lease a rectory that is no longer in use, the area's Catholic population shrinking. The caveat is that the group will have to raise money for the thousands of dollars of renovations needed to make the building habitable. While this work is happening, there's a newspaper article addressing the preparation for this HIV home, where the reporter discloses the location of David's house. Area residents are interviewed. And this is a Toledo Blade article. One woman asks, I just don't know why this has to be in a Black neighborhood. Another resident asks, what are they going to do with their refuse? The tensions between care and contamination between Black and white residents emerge as a salient thread for me. Perhaps it is only my own bias as a university professor teaching critical disability studies, as a co-producer of this film about a unique HIV house in the middle of the US Rust Belt, or as a white American supporting the BLM movement and outraged by current federal leadership in a pandemic that is disproportionately killing Black and brown Americans. In the early days of David's house, in so many ways, represents a form of disability justice, and this is what particularly interests me as a disability studies scholar. Disability justice is defined as, and I'm quoting one of our leaders here, movement building framework that would center the lives, needs, and organizing strategies of disabled, queer, and trans, and/or Black and brown people marginalized from mainstream disability rights organizing's white-dominated single-issue focus, end quote. At the time when David's house was imagined, there was a robust independent living facility that organized around disability rights, and yet no collaboration with the Ability Center of Northwest Ohio appears in the written records of David's House Compassion. It is perhaps true that the Ability Center did not know the organizing of David, except that their current executive director met with the facilities committee to approve plans for ramps and bathrooms in the house. It is also perhaps true that David's House board members did not understand their work as disability work for several reasons. The first is that in interviews I learned that one of the drives for developing David's House comes from a local hospice nurse who is providing care for HIV clients and recognizes the need for more consistent, comprehensive, and stigma-free living conditions for those who at the time are dying of HIV. It's also true that those understandings of disability, despite legal incorporation under the ADA, has distanced itself from HIV. So Ruth Coker has written about the contested relationship between disability activists and HIV activists during the drafting of the Americans with Disability Act. Disability activists distancing themselves from those living with HIV in order to achieve and pass the act to achieve disability rights. And in disability rights history, there's a long history of white disability activists distancing themselves from multiply stigmatized populations, so queer people, Black and brown people, poor people. Whatever the reason, there was not a more robust collaboration or long-term coalition building between HIV activists and disability activists in Toledo. The fact remains that David's House was doing disability justice work. As Patty Byrne writes, quote, "A disability justice framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential, that all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We know we are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. Disability justice holds a vision born out of a collective struggle, drawing upon the legacies of cultural and spiritual resistance within 1,000 underground paths, igniting small, persistent fires of rebellion in everyday life." In the late 1990s, cultural theorist Paula Treichler reflects on 2 decades of HIV representation. And this is where the epigraph comes from. She writes at length about the meaning making of HIV, what Susan Sontag has called the stigmatizing illness of the 20th century. How the virus signifies failures of biomedical and political institutions. These failures continue to resonate today during our COVID-19 crisis in the United States, where, much like AIDS in the Reagan era, presidential leadership has failed to create a cohesive, transparent policy based upon scientific and biomedical evidence, leading the US population at the time of this writing, accounting for 40% of the world's infections with 200,000 deaths. Additionally, while we admire our frontline workers and first responders within our medical system, the COVID crisis has revealed the failures of a system that lacks universal health care, a system that connects healthcare to employment at the time of the largest job loss since the 1930s. Essential workers are disproportionately Black and brown and lack access to care despite their increased exposure. Black and brown communities are dying at higher rates today, just as they were in the 1980s and 1990s. Political theorist Kathy Cohen writes about the invisibility of HIV in the Black community, at least to white political leaders and AIDS activists. We witness this invisibility in the story of David's House. While we have been living with the knowledge of AIDS for 40 years in the United States, we have yet to address the social, political, and biomedical failures that are again hitting headlines. Yet despite these failures, I want to suggest that creating a film about HIV care facility during a global pandemic offers us a chance to understand citizenship itself as a site of vulnerability. If we understand citizenship this way, then we can recognize that collectives like those that founded David's House offer us a model of messy, coalitional, and crip care work essential for surviving and belonging in a pandemic. So those are just a few ideas of what I'm thinking about as a disability studies scholar and activist. And I'm now going to turn things over to Holly, who has a few questions for you guys to consider.
How do I bring my slide up?
I just stopped sharing. So then I'll share yours now.
Oh, here it is. Oh, okay, great. Perfect. Okay, super. Uh-oh, there's a window on my screen and I don't know what to press. Anyway, so, I'm hearing myself too. Someone's, okay. So far, as what Ally has said in terms of this starting a year ago, more than a year ago now, I'm at a 24-minute, what I would call a work in progress of only Chico's portrait. So there's still 4 other people that I have some pre-visualization ideas about. But really, I've only had time and dedication towards Chico. Chico has also been in fairly ill health as of late, and I was encouraged by Sue Carter to kind of tell his story first, and which would be difficult enough, but then COVID hits. And so now we had to go into location and work with somebody who has a almost completely depleted immune system, trying to keep him safe so he can continue on to tell his story, which he really, really wants to do. And so a lot of our planning over the summer, the first month of planning, was about just trying to find the balance of keeping the distance and keeping the distance, but also creating images that creating an intimacy, because as a director, you always want your audience to connect with your subjects. So there was a lot of strategizing going on with that. And I was working with some really talented students of mine. One, Ali Musa, who I don't think is with us, is a recent grad. He graduated last year. And then Gabe Kovac, who is with us today. He's currently a student, and he received an undergraduate research award to work on this project with me. So if you have questions at the end, oh, sorry, that's me. If you have questions at the end for him and his experience, I'm sure he'd love to share. As Dwight said at the beginning, and I'm not sure of how many of you heard, but I did show a very brief cut of Chico's interview last year at Banned Books Vigil, which is coming up next week, right, Paulette?
Yes.
Monday and Tuesday? Okay.
Monday through Thursday.
Okay, great. We can give more information about that towards the end as well. But Allie and Lee and I will be presenting there, but a different kind of presentation than what we're showing today. So in my process, in my creative process, I'm always questioning, where I am in that process along the timeline. And looking at Chico's portrait right now, I know it's not done, but it's getting pretty close. And then I have to question, well, is this a piece of a whole or a whole piece in and of itself? So the piece of a whole comes in with this initial concept that I was going to make a feature-length documentary that was going to profile these 5 people, and that David's house was kind of the thread that was running through. And as I work, I think it's a lot like sculpture, and it's a lot like writing. I'm sure many of you are writing quite a bit, where you're just writing, you're outlining, you're revising, you're going back, you're writing, and that's essentially what the editing process is. And this will be the first time, other than a sympathetic audience of mostly my wife, I think, and my camera operators, that I'm sharing the content with people. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. And Mysoon, I wanted to say thank you for coming, and I'm so excited that you're here, because last year during World AIDS Day, we had this screening at the museum, and Mysoon was the moderator of the discussion after that. So I'm really excited to hear what you think of what we've been able to do. When we showed it at the museum, and when we showed it during Banned Books, we didn't have any B-roll to cut to. It was just A-roll, talking heads. And the museum screening was particularly challenging because I had to feature everyone, and it was over an hour long in duration. So trying to find the rhythms and create the rhythms of just talking heads it's a big challenge, but we pulled it off. I thought we had a great screening. It really ignited a spark within me to say, okay, Holly, you need to kind of redirect the projects that you're working on, and really focus on this, because this is not only an important project, but there's a lot of backing behind it, and that's super exciting. People get behind your work. So you'll see in the chat, hopefully you can see in the chat, that there is a Vimeo link. It's a private link, and after today, that link will go down. But when we step away, I want everybody to go in and watch. It's 24 minutes and like 3 seconds, I think. And then as you're watching, if you could contemplate, those sort of 2 questions is, how did watching the film make you feel? Because that's something I'm really going to want to hear back about. And then what did watching the film make you think about? And hopefully I won't get a lot of people that's saying I was thinking about something completely different than the film. So with those things in mind, I think we can break out now and take a look at the film, unless there's any questions or comments from people.
I don't see it in the chat.
Okay.
The link in the chat.
It's all the way up at the top.
I'm at the top, I think.
So if you click on the chat icon, Allie, you can stop the screen share, please. If you click on the chat icon, Paulette, you'll see my name, and then it's vimeo.com.
I'm not getting it for some reason.
Okay, I'll put it in again. See if it's still in my cache. Yeah, it is. Here it comes. Do you see it now?
I wonder if I see your name, so now I can just get it to scroll. There, now I see it. Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. So I think it's 2:54. I think, if we get right to it, we can be back around 2:20, or 3:20, 3:25. Does that sound right?
It sounds right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, adios. See you back in a little
Bye.
bit.
Yep, bye
Bye.
everyone. We'll reconvene as soon as the video is done around 2:20, 2:25. Everybody come back here and we'll reconvene.
Okay,
Thanks.
Please come back. Thank
thank you. Here we go.
you. Okay.
We call ourselves New Yorkers. Well, I was born and raised in Spanish Harlem, which was the worst part of Harlem you could imagine. As a kid, I saw, well, I didn't actually see them, but I would hear cops at night throwing drug addicts from the roof to the backyard. And I would hear the screams, and you could hear the police radios. In those days, why I knew that they were cops. And instead of arresting these guys that were shooting up in the roof, they would just throw them off the roof and kill them. And I was a child when I would hear that. 53 East 110th Street was the building that I was raised in. That is the only building in 110th Street between Madison and Park Avenues that is still standing, because there was a famous, world famous percussionist that used to live in that building, Tito Puente. There was poverty, and fighting, gangs, you know, there was always stabbings, shootings, uh, derelict stuff. That's where I was raised in. I was born in 52, and that was the worst at that time. Spanish Harlem, which is Spanish Harlem, uh, they were all Puerto Ricans from Fifth Avenue. There was girls, there was drugs, there was music, and you can imagine the rest. From Harlem, we moved to the Bronx. Drugs. That was my life. Drugs. I hated everybody. I hated God with a passion. And one day I was walking in the Bronx. I was looking to hustle to get a fix. And I was cursing God. I mean, cursing God. I mean, calling him a punk. And that was the nicest word I said to him. Every time I would call him a bad name, which was the only thing I did, I keep hearing this voice saying, I love you. Now, I didn't know where that was coming from, and I thought I was just losing my mind, but I just kept walking and talking and cursing God and everything, and I hated my life. Uh, there was really no reason to live for it. But that day, as I was walking, there was 3 kids in the subway. This is where my whole life turns around. They started talking to me, and they were young kids. They had these big old Bibles under their arms, and going to church, and doing the good thing. And they talked me into going to church with them, but I was only going to church for money. I told them, I'll go to church, but you're gonna have to pay me to go to church. And they said, oh, we'll give you what you want and more. As I got closer to the church, I heard this voice again, and the voice said, and this is going to sound crazy, I know that, but I don't care, but that's what happened. The voice said, before you come to my house, you must be clean. And then I heard the voice again. And that day, the Lord got to me. The Lord got to me. And that's when my life changed. The pastor took me under his wing. Told him the truth about me. I didn't hold back. I didn't realize that you can't just walk away from drugs, especially heroin. You just can't do that. Eventually your body's going to be talking to you and telling you, I need a fix. And so I started straying away little by little. And the pastor seen this in me and talked to me and told me about this place that I could go to, a drug rehab. They have like an induction center where you go to for 3 or 4 months, and then from there you go out of the city and you go to some country place. And I ended up in Pennsylvania somewhere. And after I graduated that, I stayed around there. I stayed with this Pennsylvania Dutch family. And this was back in the 70s. And to this day, I still stay in touch with them. I was the darkest thing in the whole county. I don't think the cats and dogs were darker than me. And I got along with all of them. And I lived with this one family. I worked with the old man. I called him Pops. And his wife, I called her Moms. And they had 5 daughters. And ironically, they had lost a son that would have been my exact age. I finished that, and anyway, as time went on, things went on, and I moved to California. I met this girl, Debbie. I fell in love with her big time. And I knew that she was HIV positive at the time. And I told her that I would take care of her, and I did. She was HIV positive, I was not. And one day, I was trained to giving her intravenous medication. And a lady from visiting nurse service came every day for 2 weeks to train me into giving her this medication. So in the meantime, while she was in bed mostly all the time towards the end, I used to carve. And I got that from Pops, my Pennsylvania Dutch dad.
Mhm.
And one day I was carving, and when you carve, you get cut. There's no two ways about it. No big deal. Then Debbie said, it's time for my meds. And I said, oh, okay. So I stopped what I was doing. And ironically, the first thing you have to do is give her a bag of saline, to flush everything up. Well, that saline bag broke. That broke. It emptied out in the apartment. Her blood just started squirting out of the tube, and then it fell on me. She looked at my hand and she panicked, and I said, "Nah, it's okay. It's just a little cut. That shouldn't be nothing." I called Dr. MacArthur right away, told him what happened, and he says, "I want you to come here now and test." So I did that, and he says, "If you got infected, we're not going to find out for another 6 months or 3 months. I forget what it was. So the next time I went to test, I tested positive. It was 94. It was 94 because that was the year that she passed. The thing was that when I came from California, I had done some time in the penitentiary, and I just came over. I said, "The heck with my parole and all that, and I'm just gonna go and take care of Debbie." And that was my whole life. I figured once she's gone, then I'll just go to California and say, "Here I am," you know. But it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen that way. The last time that I took her to the hospital here, she was in bad shape. She was in bad shape. She had been literally throwing up her guts. There was nothing but blood clots, and it was bad. It was bad. Her body was breaking up inside, deteriorating. And I spoke to Dr. MacArthur. I wish he was here now because he was the best doctor I've ever known. And I said, "Is there anything you could do for her?" I told him, "You've worked miracles before, Doc." And he said, that she was dying. So I have been in that. They had a unit for HIV. And so I was constantly there because she was constantly there. And the nurses already knew me by name, met a lot of patients that I knew that I wasn't going to see for long. And that came out to be true. And then I didn't tell Debbie what the doctor told me because I didn't have the heart to say, "Oh, by the way, babe, you're dying," you know. So I just stayed there, and after 3 days, she says, "Chico, those bird baths that you're taking in the bathroom, they ain't working that much. You need to go home and relax and drink a beer." She said, "You haven't had a beer in 3 or 4 days, and you're driving me crazy." And I said, "No, I'm okay. I don't want to be home alone. She said, "No, you're going home tonight and come back tomorrow." Well, there wasn't going to be no tomorrow because I went home. I drank a beer. The beer tasted lousy. I took a shower. And I still felt dirty. And I don't know, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I decided to go for a walk. And some cop pulled me over to the side. I wasn't driving or nothing, but he just pulled me over. It was late at night, you know. He wanted to know who I was and what the heck I was doing. And I told him and everything, and he says, all right, no problem. And he says, well, just for the heck of it, let me run a make on you. I said, okay. I've been stopped before and nothing ever happened. I guess it hadn't gotten here yet, the news that I was a felon at large. And the warrant came out while she was in the hospital dying. That was the last time I saw her alive. Um, and I knew that I had my own self to deal with. So I just went to David's house and they said, we were kind of waiting on you. And as a matter of fact, we have a place for you. We have a room for you. So I lived there for a while. And you know, David's house every once in a while had a bunch of riffraff in there. You know, some of them were just there. They were HIV positive, but they were just there to scam the place, thinking that we were weak people. Well, maybe some of them were, but that's not me. You know, I pretty much ran that place. It was April Fools that they actually got a room for me. I kept calling them and saying, has anybody died? Because that's the only way I could get a room. And I lived there from April the 1st. I lived there exactly 13 months. And that was the goal of David's house, that you could either stay there until your time came and or until you get your stuff, if you have something up here, to go get your own place. You know, if you didn't have the funds, they would let you stay there for as long as you lived. They were very good. Those people were very good. I got along with everybody there. Toledo made David's house. They paid the bills. Individuals. They didn't get none from the government. It was just generous, rich people that, I mean, the Christmases there, forget about it. Out freaking outrageous. And it wasn't just for us, the residents. I mean, we were treated like kings and queens. Every day was a feast. And it was home cooked meals. Every day was a feast. I'm not going to say thank God for Ryan White because that poor kid, you know, I know what he suffered with because I saw other people, not just my wife, but I saw other people. Um, Peter, Peter lived in the door right across from me. And towards the end, he started deteriorating. And he was the one that we would call the godfather of David's house because if he wasn't acting right, he'd get on your shit. And so we all respected him. But towards the end, I was the one who would give him a bath, feed him sometimes, put the movies that he wanted. And he always wanted one movie, The Wizard of Oz. So I would put that on for him. And then they didn't allow pets in there, you know. They never allowed pets in there. But the day that he died, I had checked in on him. I would get up early just for him to see how he was. And this particular day, I checked in on him, and he was still breathing. He was sleeping, so I left him alone. And then later on in the early morning, somebody knocked on my door and said that we lost Peter. And I said, no, I just checked on him. So I got up and I went to him and I checked on him and he was gone. And Peter was a by the book type of dude. You know, everything had to be precise, even in his eating. And I remember this one time he was in the hospital and he used to love those Twizzlers and he used to eat them very daintily. Except that one day he said, the hell with this. He just started chowing down on them. I said, you go, boy. That's the way to eat them. And but that day that he died, a puppy showed up in our doorstep. A puppy, just out of the blues. A cute little old puppy just showed up and just stood there right in the front door, like waiting for somebody to take him in. And the staff had definitely said, we can't have pets in here. But when they saw that little doggy, and he was a little puppy too, I don't know where his mom or dad was, but nobody knew. But they said, that dog is for Chico. And I named that dog Repeat. I named him Repeat.
Out of there. Back here. Right there. Oh, I thought I did. Yeah.
Holly, I just realized that I left it recording the whole time, so
Oh,
video with a long gap.
well,
But I think they can edit that out. They can probably just, edit the gap out.
okay, yeah, and it was only playing back the audio. We weren't seeing the video.
Shouldn't have played anything. It should have
Well,
just been.
I think Paulette was playing on her computer, and she didn't have her microphone muted, so that was coming in the Blackboard,
Okay.
I'm
which is fine. Oh, that's okay. You really should replace that battery, though, in that smoke detector, Paulette.
I'm working on it. I got one of them yesterday.
Okay. It is that time of the year, right? We're supposed to do that when the time changes.
That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I kept looking. I was looking around my house. I'm like, is that in my house? But then I realized it was your house.
I've just
That's
been
okay.
so busy this fall.
Sure. It's a whole different newness.
It is.
There is buzzing and robot voices.
I like the collaborate.
Do you still hear robot voices, Allie? I sound like a robot? I sound like a robot?
You sound
I
like
can't hear you.
you sound like Darth Vader.
I mean, that's weird.
And there's a buzzing too. Is that on my end or your end?
I don't know. How do I
think
sound?
it's on your end because she sounds normal to me.
Really? Okay. Then
Me
I'll
too,
I'll
yeah.
log off and come back in. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think Allie has great Wi-Fi where she is.
Hello.
Hello. How's it now?
You sound regular. I don't know what happened there just now. I logged in and it was all
Well,
good.
I have a theory, but I'm not.
You said
I think
that I
it
don't
has.
have great Wi-Fi.
Yeah, so you probably filled up your RAM with your streaming, and then all sorts of
Ah,
bad stuff happened.
cool. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I wasn't trying to slam you in any way.
It's okay. I'm not offended.
Okay.
How about if
So,
we get?
I hope we,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I hope we get most people back. It looks like we have gotten.
It looks
many
like we
back.
have. In all the presentations, you get some attrition along the way. People got class or something, so they leave early. So
Sure.
we may not get every single person back. But I was going to
Right.
propose we go ahead and get started with Q&A or comments, see what people
Yeah,
have to say.
absolutely.
yeah, it sounds good.
Okay.
So people, any questions, comments, thoughts? We had a couple questions for ourselves too. If anybody wants to offer any thoughts on those questions, what Holly threw out to us.
I'll start. Holly,
Okay.
I hadn't seen this most recent cut because I know you were working on it in the past few days to sort of get it as close as possible to something, close to finished. But I really loved that you ended with repeat, right? The story that Chico tells about Pete and repeat. And I think that's really interesting to think about how residents of the house were also caretakers in the house, right? And the relationships that were built in that community among the residents. My soon is asking if anyone's looking at the chat box, if Holly could remind us of what the question. were.
How did you feel when you were watching the film, and what were you thinking about when you were watching the film?
And there was the third one, right, which was like, is this a whole piece or a piece of a whole? So is this part of is that, do you want to
that's
talk
more of
about
a
that
question. Oh,
okay.
That's more of a question for me, but I'll probably ponder that from what people say, from today.
I was really struck when he was talking about he was doing nothing but walking, and the police stopped him. And I thought that was really, it's sort of part of the problem we have with institutional racism, is that people, if they're brown or black, he wasn't in a car, wasn't carrying a rifle or anything, although we do have that law that says they can carry guns in Ohio. But still, they stopped him when all he was doing was taking a walk. And I thought that was really, I just thought that was really a part of the problems that he would have to live with in his life, is that he would always be under suspicion. Even when he obviously wasn't doing anything that should be a problem or wrong, he would still have to answer questions. But I really liked the film.
Thank you.
M says in the chat box, hey M, what's up? I thought it was heartbreaking, the combination of his name being ran by the police while his wife was in the hospital. And Mysoon says, how I felt low-level dread. I would love to hear more about that, Mysoon, if you're willing to chime in. And Tasha says, were the other stories you gathered as layered, intense, and heartbreaking as this one?
I think yes, but not packed with such irony. I think for me, the in Chico's story, the intensity and the impact is that just the irony that every time he makes a turn, something like profoundly tragic, ironic happens. So yeah, they're very layered. The other stories are, but like I said, not with quite so much irony.
Mysoon says that she kept waiting for one hammer after another to dread or to drop maybe, and Chico was so calm, and Chico was so calm about relating his account that you think it will be okay, and then another hammer comes down. And I think that is something about Chico's affect that I noticed while I was interviewing, right, was that you could ask him a question and it was just like this calm, even tone for, I mean, I think that first interview in 2019, he talked for over an hour at least.
He did. I think he talked the longest, but he's such a natural storyteller.
Right.
And he's obviously told this story more than once, Yeah. I think, yeah. But yeah, and it still doesn't end with Chico right now. He's suffering through cancer. So anyway.
M in the chat says it's also interesting to see it highlighted how the passing of HIV, I think sort of the contracting of HIV, doesn't follow the stereotyped way of contracting HIV.
Exactly, and that's where I see the irony, and that's the way that I tried to set it up in the beginning, because you think he's going to get HIV from sharing needles, or, but he doesn't. He gets HIV because he was being a caretaker. He was taking care of his wife, and this just random thing, crazy thing happened.
Mm-hmm. M says, well done, exclamation point.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tasha wants to know, can you speak to the interview process and the ethics involved? I guess I can start. So one of the things about doing documentary film, which was a new thing for me, was that you don't have to go through IRB for documentary film, but there are plenty of sort of film ethics that you're sort of thinking about as a documentary filmmaker, and there's everyone has to sign disclosure forms, right, for the film. And one of the things that I sort of set out to do when I was thinking about what interview questions, was to ask as much as I could about to get a whole picture of the person. So one of the things I learned early on in my research, working with women living with HIV, was that if you ask the question, so tell me about yourself, because they're recruited, because they're living with HIV, they start with, so I got HIV this way, right? That's their beginning of their narrative. It's like their life begins with HIV because of the way we've created narrative expectations as interviewers. So what was important to me was to sort of begin by asking really simple questions, which was like, so tell me, where and when were you born, right? So just in things that wouldn't necessarily need to be on camera, but just to get a sense of what time period we're talking about, and to also let folks ease into the interview. So how did you grow up? What was that like? Are you from this area? All of those kinds of things. Other things you want to highlight, Holly, about ethics or the interview process?
It takes a lot of management, sort of pre-planning, getting all the forms together, making sure that everybody knows that there will be forms to sign. And I need to work with people who can help me keep track of those things, which is not my strong point at all. So Allie has all those things.
We do. We have all those things.
Yeah. I think, the ethics in the moment are always difficult. Maybe not the ethics. I'm not sure how the words to best explain this, but there are times in an interview where I want to push somebody maybe a little harder to go a little further, but I also don't want to pressure them in any sort of way. So that's always kind of like just something I have to continually practice as a filmmaker, and then figuring out, not everything is going to be applicable from one interview to another, but just trying to figure out. And I think it goes back to, preparation for one, but also rhythms. Everything to me is about rhythm and going back to the rhythms of the moment. And can you be mindful of those? And does it feel right? Do you think that they'll go there? And I've missed some opportunities in my career for maybe not going a little bit further. And I kind of regret that at times, but also at the same time, I want to be like really respectful when I'm with people.
I think too, one of the things that's interesting about last summer's interviews, 2019, was that we didn't have an angle for what we were quote unquote looking for, right? We were just asked to sort of capture life histories, right? So it was very broad questions, worked really well. And I think this summer we had more focus because we wanted to know, we had seen the angle of David's house, and so we wanted to know and talk to people more specifically about David's house and to get more of that backstory. Robert says, I'm so grateful that you allowed us to follow his story, that we could listen with you. The rhythm provides a feeling of intimacy. We are in Chico's narrative time, the pace of his recollection. You provide an extraordinary sense of place. The visuals are layered, thereby ensuring that everything is a place. My feelings were similarly layered and rich, always more than one feeling. Thank you. And then Paulette says his story of watching the police toss addicts off rooftops also points to the problems of the policing in our country. And Tasha,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Allie and I were talking about this yesterday when we were prepping for the meeting, and I kept saying the circumstances of Chico's life, and that we're so, in terms of where we're born and when we're born, we have no control over that. But then she's like, well, I would call that systemic oppression. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. So I want, all of these stories have systemic oppression in them. Chico's is obviously very relevant now because of where we are in our cultural moment. But if I, as a filmmaker, as the director, can walk away knowing that people are pondering that I don't even know how to say it, but that idea of like, well, is it just sort of blind circumstance, unfortunate circumstance? Or maybe I do need to think about more about how the systems in which, we have to live under affect, influence, impact those circumstances. Mm-hmm. That would make me so happy.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's really interesting in terms of going through the archives of David's house and finding the story of sort of the neighbors being concerned about why this quote unquote AIDS house was moving into their Black neighborhood, is the idea that it's going to invite people who are contagious, people who are dangerous, right? And then David's house ends up having such an amazing relationship with the neighbors in the community, even though, as Chico says, there were lots of riffraff that lived there, and like literally ex-junkies, ex-felons, you know, I mean, everybody that rises to the top of the not in my backyard, you know, list, right? And so I think that that's really interesting, because when you tell a story of HIV, you can't look for, you know, the quote unquote the pure figures that are going to get all the sympathy. Chico's a complicated figure, right?
Yep.
Neither innocent nor purely guilty, right? Like he's navigating these systems of oppression and making choices around those systems of oppression. So I think all of the stories sort of are shaped by that complication. I think now finally we have room in 2020 to tell those complicated stories, as opposed to just telling the story of Ryan White, right? Or just telling the story of the person who, you know, is a transformed, you know, has totally turned their lives around and completely transformed and has all this regret, or whatever the case might be. So I think all the stories are complicated in that way.
Absolutely. They're all very, very, which is both exciting and like completely overwhelming. Because it's just like, what do I leave out? And so that goes back to this idea, is this a whole piece or a piece of a whole? And then me contemplating, well, is this just a single feature length, or do I have a series here? And so there might be a series. So I need to work with some broadcasters and find out what the possibility for distribution on series are like, because I've never done a series before, so I'd be really curious about that process.
M wants to know, has detection times remained similar from then and now? And what do you mean? Do you mean that when, like the 6 months that Chico had to wait to get a positive test? Yes. You know, we have some experts here. I know Richard Meeker is on the line. Richard, do you want to answer that question for M?
So just to clarify, I'm assuming that you're talking about from the time that you're tested until the time that you get your result. And those times have definitely changed since the early 90s, where there was a 2-week waiting period from the time that you did your test. At that time, they were doing a blood draw, and they would send that into the lab. It would be tested. The result would be sent back to the clinic, and then you would pick your result up with your counselor in 2 weeks from the time that you had your test done. And they have moved to an oral swab that you can get your results in 20 minutes. And now they have testing that it's called an Insti test, which they are using. And it's a finger stick with a droplet of blood. And I believe you get your results in about 3 minutes from the time that test is done.
Richard, what about you think you have an exposure the night before and you go get an HIV test? Will you be able to see it 24 hours after an exposure?
No. If your exposure is that night, that's still not going to tell you if you were infected with HIV. It would only tell you if you were infected within the last 3 months, because it would take your body about 3 months to develop the antibodies that they're testing for.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question too, in terms of thinking about, you know, if you have a one night stand with somebody and a condom breaks, right? Like this sort of typical heterosexual thing, right? And you go and you can get, you know, a pregnancy test, and you have to sort of, you can't, you know, find out if you're pregnant the next day, but you can get the morning after pill the next day, but you can get an HIV test the next day, but it's not going to, you have to still wait and take another HIV test, and they recommend 3 months later after the exposure. So it's really good to sort of know about those timings. I think one of the other question marks about David's house that we're trying to fill in the blanks of. We have a lot of info about the beginning of David's house, but much less about the end of David's house. So that's something that we're still developing in terms of interviews and archival stuff. Robert says, among the surprising elements of Chico's story are those transformative times in his life when he is welcomed in spirit in his chosen adopted family and the community he finds and helps to nurture and sustain. He carries through a thread of grace, kindness, gratitude, and hope in his story.
Yeah, he's a forever optimist.
It's true.
Gabe, do you want to talk about anything as your experience working on this? I don't want to put you on the spot, but
you're fine.
You're a talker.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Get myself up. So I think it was really challenging being asked to do this. I wasn't all too familiar with the process of making a film at this point. I was still pretty early in my my education, and we talked about it, becoming a passion project after a while, because you realize how much effort you begin putting into it, and there's just this incredible human element to it that kind of makes it impossible not to become a passion project. And I think that was really what drew me to it, because I could have viewed it as, this is an undergraduate research project, and that's it. It's just the experience of getting to work on a documentary, yada, yada, yada. But it's not that for any of us, me, Ali, especially Holly, obviously, and Allie, and all the collaborators. It's kind of, and Chico is the first person that we shot on film, and it's just, you realize how incredible these people are and how they're right down the road from you. I mean, it just really brings about this kind of discourse about human beings and how much we all go through, and people like Chico who go through so much, just continue to be these compassionate, compelling people. And it was really challenging at first because with myself and not knowing where I was going to be in terms of being able to produce it, it was like, am I going to be able to capture that? And that was something that Holly and I and Ali really worked on, is we really visualized it, and we watched different films, and really got into the meat of what made Chico Chico. And kind of along with the questions asked about, where to go morally and ethically in capturing, he's such an open book. And I think that was something that made him so interesting, and just so emotionally jarring to be in the same space with him. I mean, it's still incredible watching him on video, but at the same time, when you're in the room with him, there's just this energy he has that's just unbelievable. And it's almost easy to capture it. I mean, it was, you face issues and everything. It was hot out, whatnot. You're carrying a 40.
It was so hot.
Yeah. You're worried about,
it was 97 degrees when we shot that.
It was insane.
And it was end of day. It was end of day, and it was 97 degrees.
You're following the social distancing and everything. And but I mean, it's just like, wow, you realize that you're telling this person's story, and it just becomes a passion project. It just becomes incredibly important. And I think that that's why this work is so important to me, is you just realize how incredibly relevant it is, and the conversations that it brings about, the questions about ourselves, and how we treat each other. It's just incredible. It's been great to work on it. So thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think one other thing that occurred to me in relation to ethics was that when Sue Carter really helped to recruit for this project for long-term survivors, everybody that she recruited had participated in some way on the Speakers Bureau that UTMC Ryan White's Clinic has had, or if not on the Speakers Bureau, Like one of the women that we interviewed had written a book that you could order on Amazon, right? So they were already in the position of publicly telling their stories in some format or another, which I think was an important part of Sue's sort of work in recruiting and talking about the project. I think Sue was very careful to identify long-term survivors who were comfortable with a public image of living with HIV.
Right. And what a curator of content, you know, because she just brought to us so many diverse stories, but still these common threads run through all of them. David's house being obviously one of them. I mean, nobody got HIV in the same way. No one's lived with it the same way, but they all were very much connected to David's house. David's house was essential for their care and their long-term survival.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it looks like things have gone quiet out there. So we kick it back to Dwight now, or any?
Yeah, this is me. We've gone over time, so we should probably wrap it up.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah.
Since I'm host, I get to extend it for one more minute and say something. I take that privilege. And I just want to say, I'm glad to read these comments, hear what people are saying, because sometimes I wonder if I'm like too emotional or just too sensitive or something. And you know, that when I saw it a year ago, it was really powerful. I mean, I think you showed it in the morning, and that the rest of the day I couldn't think about anything else. You know, my day was done at the point. Robert Sember's comments are especially eloquent. He says it much better than I could. But yeah, this is a very special person who's got quite a presence on the screen, and the story that he tells, or the stories that he tells, are very powerful indeed. For what it's worth, not that I'm an expert film or anything, but regarding that question of whether this is a piece of a whole or a whole piece itself, I wonder if it could just be both. I mean, it stands on its own,
Absolutely.
but yeah, maybe it could also fit it, you know, use it in both ways. So those are my thoughts. There's some other comments.
Come in here at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think.
Is there? I know in Zoom you can save the chat. I don't know in Blackboard if you can do that, but I'd love to be able to save this.
It's
the
recording
actual chat content.
So yeah, I think it is recording them. It's saving. I think so.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and sharing your time, and you know, sitting in front of the computer again for this. I know that's not easy to do these days.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, thanks everybody, and thanks to both of you. This is a fantastic presentation. I'll let reminds us that Banned Books Week starts next Monday through Thursday. So just a reminder about that. And there's a website, UT Banned Books Coalition. So be sure to check that out. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again to my presenters. We'll be in touch with our next presentation for next week.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great set.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Dwight. It was awesome. Went really well.
Thank you, Dwight.
Thanks, both of you. I'll be in touch with both of you when this is when we get it up on YouTube. I'll tell you before we put it up on YouTube because it recorded the audio. We got to talk about that. So I'll be in touch. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Take care.
Joy.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.
Allie, let's go chat. Oops.